Okay, so I want to thank Michael. I'm a little nervous because this is the first time that I've spoken as someone that's gone through this existential crisis and formed their own business. You know, it's interesting because we're all a product of what we know and what we've learned and where we come from. So I want to talk a little bit about how we learn and where we learn and what we do with what we learn. It's interesting because, you know, this nature versus nurture is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but this idea of where we are from, where we live, who we hang out with, informs every decision we make. The interesting thing about how work evolves is that it's not driven just by this linear path of you graduate, you go on, and you move on to the next thing. What I've really discovered is that as we work over time, we develop new interests. Whether it starts as a hobby, and then you become an expert, and you spend, you know, Gladwell's 10,000 hours developing skills around something, and you start to explore different avenues at work, within work, and also at home, which might start to influence work. So you do a lot of different things. You do a lot of different aspects in work. And so really what I've landed on, and kind of where I've started to hone the way I approach things at work, is that we go through this kind of series of steps of discovering interests and making connections. You know, what's interesting about discovering interests is, like I said, they might begin as a hobby. And so you're trained as an architect. I'm trained as an architect. And while doing architecture, I start to do a lot of graphic design. While I'm doing graphic design, I start to develop a book. While I do a book, I start to talk to people about copy and advertising, and I go into advertising. So the trajectory starts to change. And then you think the grass is greener, and you go on back to architecture, and you do something else. That interest that I started to go down that path starts to inform the architecture and the decisions that you make as a professional. And so it's interesting because an interest is by no means an expert. But when you have an interest in something, you start to make connections, just like you guys are doing here at this conference. You're sitting across the table from somebody that might be a developer, and you're in construction, and you start to learn how they do things, and you learn about modular, and you get really excited about the possibility of something new. Then you have to do something farther to take this into the workplace, and that's this gaining knowledge. You know, the idea of having an interest in something and just meeting somebody that's really good at it doesn't make you able to do it. So it's this process of how you develop your interests and your knowledge and start to develop that. Then once you have the knowledge, you develop an understanding. And it's how you apply that to work, which is really important. And then this last step, do good work, that's something that I think we're still trying to attain. I'm still trying to attain. And I'll touch on that briefly at the very end. But what's interesting about my own journey is that, like I said, discovering interest and then making the right connections and then gaining knowledge has not been this linear process. You bounce around with the way that you learn. So where in the ideal food chain scenario, it's a linear path. But what actually happens is that you discover interests in any topic. You make some connections. You might start to gain some knowledge. And then before you develop any kind of understanding in that topic or any kind of ability to do good work in that topic, you're on to the next one. So I find a new interest before I've even become an expert in the previous interest. Ironically, sometimes that you don't even go all the way that far through the path. Or other times it comes in a different direction. I might make a connection with somebody, which then sparks an interest. So I may meet somebody that's doing an amazing amount of modular work and really think, okay, this is something that is super fascinating. How can I apply that to what I'm doing? And so it's understanding and recognizing what you're doing and how you're doing it that becomes something that starts to inform your work. So some of my interests in my past have been around experiential and digital work. And so that led to this trajectory of doing a lot of app development, brand development. And this was at a time when the architecture was kind of taking a back seat, but this was very spatial, and it had a lot of impact on the way that the architecture developed. And then, as I said, I started to then do work where I had done product development from a digital standpoint and thinking about spatial design as a product development process. And so this idea of learning about systems and processes and different aspects and avenues started to inform the work that I was doing. So I'll give you some specific examples. Some of you may know the Yas Hotel. It's a hotel in Abu Dhabi. It was recently just acquired by W Hotel. It was a Viceroy before that, and before that was owned by the client and run by the Sheikh. It's an interesting project because it's iconic in that the Formula One track runs through the hotel. It's also an interesting hotel because of the speed. This was a project that the competition was won by our firm in November 21st of 2007, and by December 6th we were piling, and we were open 18 months later. So 10 years ago this month we opened after only 18 months of design and construction. So to do a project of this scale, 500 keys, convention center, parking garage, plaza, 3 bridges because of the track going over it, and also a completely unconventional design, required us to set aside the way that we approach projects and really develop things in a different way. And so to make a project like this succeed, we had to stop thinking that we were the experts and that we were just kind of the mediator amongst the experts, like a room like this, for example. And so at our peak, we had 33 firms that we were working with on delivery for this project, not including all of the construction companies that were doing the development of the site. So we had 6 architecture firms, 3 bridge engineering firms, 6 structural engineering firms, and it was just a massive undertaking to move quickly. The other thing that became really important about this project was understanding where to go to find the right information. So working with the best grid shell designers, working with Frank Gehry on the designing of the scaffolding, because he's the only architect that had done such complex structures that we could figure out how to support the building as we built it. So we actually had Gehry Technologies on site working on just things like the scaffolding. Even the 3D bridges, they're curved in both directions. We didn't know how to do that, so we just called Anish Kapoor and said, who built the beam? And then we developed the bridge with the same manufacturers that did the beam. So this is a 2-story beam that's straddling the racetrack and had to be assembled off-site outside of Amsterdam in 16 weeks, delivered to the site in 16 weeks. So it's a huge undertaking to deliver something like that so fast, so we had to go where the work is. This is where my career really started to change, was developing the interiors quickly. We couldn't rely on traditional millwork shops to get the architecture that we wanted. So this is, for those of you that don't know, this is the Aston Martin assembly facility, I don't want to say plant, facility where they make the 177, which is a handmade Aston Martin. And so they also made our reception desk. You know, we had to start looking at different ways of manufacturing. So we did a lot with automotive. And we worked with Porsche and Audi and VW quite a bit on some of the fabrication techniques. While I was doing work with Porsche and Audi, I learned about their MQB program, which is something that I think really affected the way I've pursued with all my projects since. And that is that 60 to 75% of all their cars use the same platform, which is a really fascinating thing if you could think about how that could apply to the built environment. So if you can imagine that transporter on the Volkswagen Transporter, the large one, is 65% the same as the little 2-seater Seat. It's kind of hard to imagine that they're sharing that many parts. But developing a process around that I think that's really interesting. So I actually left Asymptote and the Yas Hotel project after it completed and did a really kind of a 180 and joined Starbucks. And when I joined Starbucks, it was at a point in time where they were changing the brand from green laminate to something else. So we developed that something else. In the process of developing that something else, I had just come off this tract of working with the automotive industry on how to do things differently and how to think about rollout differently. So at the same time we were developing a new architecture, and I don't know if you can remember back to my list of 5 steps, but I haven't gotten to do good yet. We're still in like developing understanding, maybe still gaining knowledge. But applying those principles to how to test things quickly and prototype things quickly, we developed this product called 15th Avenue Coffee and Tea, which was our Starbucks prototyping facility. It was a working coffee shop where we tested new things. But testing in real time was something that we thought was important, not just food offerings, but design. So we changed this out every 2 or 3 months just to test things in the real kind of marketplace. So I jumped from Starbucks to Chipotle. And there I actually got a chance to take this process and go a little bit further with it and do a deeper dive. So instead of just a design change where I went from green laminates to live edge wood, I got to really think about the systems. And Chipotle, when I joined at the time, was when it was still the plywood and corrugated metal and the red wall and the Aztec art. And we really wanted to kind of understand what the core essence of Chipotle was. And the essence of Chipotle was kind of an honesty with their food. And an understanding and a perception of what the food is. And so the biggest change that we deployed in the new design of Chipotle was the open kitchen. So really showing how the food is made, showing how the food is stored, and how that can change the design. So instead of being focused on the materiality of the project, it really became about the functionality of the project. So we developed an entire set of standards, both for all of our external partners, but as well as internal. So we developed a whole series of online tools for onboarding and training and operations and modeling. And then at the same time, on a parallel track, slightly behind the development of the new standard, we were working on what we called LOMO, which is our low-cost model. What was interesting about doing that is at $856,000 a location, at 200 locations a year, if we could target $600,000 a location without detrimental impact to the brand, you can imagine what you can do with that extra money. You can either save that money or you can develop another 52 stores. So really thinking about, on a parallel track, how to develop a brand and then develop its improvement at the same time became something that I was getting interested in. So we started with the Starbucks, where it was more about aesthetic, Chipotle, which was more about function, Chipotle 2.0, which was about efficiency, and I went to WeWork. I was actually at a presentation that Michael Owens had hosted where I was talking about what we were doing at Chipotle with Lomo when I met Miguel McKelvey, the founder of WeWork. And at the time, there were 32 WeWorks, and they were all bespoke. They were all done by their in-house interior design team. And the only similarities between the projects were because of what the people were sharing verbally across the desk. This is a great wallpaper. This is a great sofa. They didn't have a supply chain or a procurement team or anything in place. So what we did was we took the same understanding and approach to the process that we had done at Chipotle, where we said, okay, let's first envision what the brand guidelines and standards should be, and then attack the efficiency model. So we developed a series of understandings of what is WeWork, and what are all of the different parameters and relationships that can involve the design solution. And we had to start big, because the scale of WeWork can be several buildings. In London, for example, we have a 16-building complex. I say we have. We had when I was there. And we have to understand, like, what are the proximities and relationships of the different possible opportunities we could put in those? Do we need boardrooms in every facility? Do we need the same size of event space in every facility? And really then start to develop some sort of logic and rhythm to this. We also then took that information and developed what we called the Genome. The Genome was a live tool that says, I'm going to understand what all the parameters of the building are. I'm going to enter that information into the system, and it'll tell me what my WeWork should be. So I'll give you a really brief example. If you have 3 floors that are continuous, that's a completely different situation than if you have 3 floors that are separated in a building. So we may do a lease deal with someone and get 2 floors towards the bottom and 1 floor fairly up high in the tower. That's a different experience. It requires a different check-in, a different amount of conference rooms, a different amount of community space, shared space, et cetera. So we had to develop the tool that would actually tell the design team, so that we could achieve significant growth on how to do that. From there, we developed kind of a language and a pattern on how to discuss the different projects. And then from that, we developed what was called the kit of parts. And the kit of parts was really the kind of bare minimum of what the architecture could be so that we could roll out WeWork fast. So we rolled this out by WeWork 37. At the time, we were doing 2 WeWorks a month. By the time this system got up and running and in place, we got to a point where in 1 month we did 50 WeWorks. It really allowed for fast rollout because we had a system that there were no questions. You knew what that needed to be programmatically. We could laser scan a space, find out exactly what the square feet is, and just run with that. Okay, so that was 1.0. Then 2.0, we came along and we said, okay, this is the bare minimum of doing the projects. And actually, with our dear friend Danny Forster, we hired Danny to actually help us think. And the interesting thing about this is, if this is the bare minimum, and we could go down the line and look at every space, but I'm just going to talk about one. So we looked at the 4-person office, and we said, we deliver a 4-person office. It has 4 desks, 4 chairs, and 4 pedestals. But then that long list, which is not made up, that long list are all the possible different activities that are actually happening in a 4-person office. And when you look at that long list, which you don't have to read it, it's more to get a point across, that we're not delivering actually how people work and how people do things. So the yoga instructor doesn't necessarily need 4 desks, 4 chairs, or 4 pedestals. The massage therapist definitely doesn't need that. The day trader needs the 4 desks, but 2 chairs because they have 4 monitors and they sit 2 people sit in there and they need more space for the thing. So what we really understood by looking at what was happening within existing WeWorks, and then by the time we did this, we had 400 WeWorks, we could really start to develop this idea of maybe we shouldn't have such a myopic view on what the parts are and what they should be. So we really then started thinking about this idea, which Danny coined as kit of possibilities. This is just a summary of some of the kit of possibilities, but the idea was, let's really think about if there's 88 activities that can happen in a 4-person office, is there a way to kind of cull those into groups so that maybe those 12 activities could fit within this floor plan option, and these 14 could be this, and this 6 could be this. And so that idea of what are the possibilities within the space start to drive a new and different standard and guidelines. So for WeWork 2.0, we've now rolled out this system where we're giving more options, but still under the same notion as discussed earlier of a guideline and less of a standard and more of let's really think about what the possibilities could be. The interesting thing about this is then there's a financial upside in that they're working on a system now where we can charge for upgrades and change. So we'll still provide you the base condition of 4 desks, 4 pedestals, and 4 chairs. If you need something different, let's talk, and we can figure out where to go from there. So then we got WeWork 2.0 done, and that was really just the core product. So we started thinking about the idea, and I think this is applicable to any industry, by the way, this idea of if we could look at our product with all kinds of different parameters, this could be program and schedule, the axes could be whatever you want to study. But if you could look at the core offering as the starting point. So so to give you an example on WeWork 2.0, we may spend on CapEx $125 a foot to build a WeWork, and OpEx is $25 a foot to operate. So what would it be to develop something that's in the upper left quadrant? What's something that's $75 a foot to build and $15 a foot to operate? So we started developing new product lines. So the team that I ran started thinking on this grid, if we could populate the whole thing, what would product look like? So we rolled out a product called HQ by WeWork. It was a single office solution. It did $40 million in its first 2 months of opening. And it really was this opportunity for people to come in and put their own name on the door. It didn't have the WeWork community space. They had access to WeWork community space at nearby WeWork locations, but it simplified the offering greatly. Then what we started to realize by developing variations for the upper left quadrant, we could start to revisit the kit of possibilities and say, what is the possible overlap of product development that could start to touch all divisions: phone booths, conference rooms, furniture types. So we started attacking the phone booth. So the WeWork phone booth, it's one of our ubiquitous space types. We've currently rolled out 15,000 phone booths. If I ran some quick numbers for you guys to talk about what's the importance of a phone booth, before we built the phone booth, we were spending $13,000 a phone booth because of millwork, sprinklers, HVAC, the leather, the lighting, everything. By containing it within a prefabricated box that we could make off-site, we could get that price from $13,000 down to originally $8,000. Since we've gotten even more savings. But you can imagine at 15,000 phone booths at $5,000 a pop, that's $75 million of savings. That's a significant savings in product development. And we can put that somewhere else. So we deployed a bunch of sensors in our phone booths to really understand how they were being used, when they were being used, and what we found is they were being used too much. So what we developed was a prototyping facility where we could start to test things and build things and really pilot things. And we really wanted to tackle this idea of how do we make a phone booth that isn't used so much? Because what was happening was that we were having members come in, signing up for a hot desk membership, posting up in the phone booth all day, and basically for the cost of a hot desk, getting their one-person office. So we made it too nice. And because it was too nice, people stayed in there all day, and then it smelled like Chipotle, and it kind of ruined the experience for the next person that might come in at 5 o'clock. It started to smell and be hot and whatever. So we started working with Vitra on a series of low-voltage frames that could then receive different accessories to the frame. So this is a prototype that you see here. We've started to test this out, but it's a phone booth that is smaller. That's not me. That's smaller, more efficient, and for every 4 phone booths, we gain a phone booth. And so you can also start to see the programmatic opportunities that you get when you do that. The other thing is that we could start to go from $8,000. We had gotten our phone booths down to about $5,000 with the previous phone booth that you saw. And now we've gotten this one down to about $3,000. So again, start to run those numbers. When you go from 13 to 3, 10,000, over 15,000. So now we're at 150 million in savings. It's a significant contribution to the brand, which allows them to build a lot more WeWork locations just from phone booth development alone. We haven't talked about all the other 57 space types yet. So then what's the opposite end of HQ by WeWork? We've got our phone booth now. We've got a standard. So we started looking at this project, code name Folkhouse, which is what's the high-end version of the product. Again, you don't have to see the plans, but we started thinking about if office is where I hunker down and do my work, is that what everyone is doing for office? And so we started thinking about the market of like leaders, like a lot of you in this room here. How do you do work? And what we found is that most of the leaders don't need an office, even though they like to have their own office, but that they're actually doing their meetings in, having coffee over steak while they're on the treadmill or whatever the case may be. Work is happening where they are, not where their office is. So we wanted to develop a system which was a completely different WeWork approach, which was developing a solution that was geared more around the activities, back to the Kit of Possibilities idea. So this was a series of spaces that we developed where it was really almost more like a Soho House environment, where it was a club kind of atmosphere for space types to allow for the leadership kind of teams that are members of WeWork to go there. So the model was almost that if you join WeWork and it's your office of 20, if you're the one that signs the lease agreement, you might have a different experience opportunity than your staff, than your team. And so we were building kind of a place for the CEOs, if that makes sense. So that was a really interesting project. That project was underway when I left WeWork in May. And I left WeWork in May and started to pursue different projects, a lot of it because of what I learned and what we weren't necessarily developing. So one of the things I started to work on was the phone booth again. I think this goes back to this idea of I had those 5 steps, and the last one was do good, and I was feeling like I was doing great work, but I didn't know if I was actually doing good work. Back to this existential crisis that I don't know if you guys have watched Abstract on Netflix, but all these great interviews with designers, and after every one I watch, I always feel like, how come I'm not doing that? And so this is a really interesting statistic. If 40% of the world's landfill is filled with construction waste, then what can we do about that? And so I started playing with this idea of, what if the phone booth typology could be expanded into something else? So my team's currently working on a series of space types, which are prefabricated, flat-packed, modular, sustainable office spaces that we're now starting to test. So we're testing these in different locations, and they are off the shelf, slightly customizable, good sound quality. But it starts to do something, because I can now order these, put these into a space, and not have to do all the demolition, and not have to do all the construction waste. And you start to get a different efficiency. I can open things quicker. The sustainability of something like this is really interesting. I think what's more interesting than the product development side is starting to think, how can I make things better? How can I do things differently? So I've been pursuing a bunch of different projects like this. I think this is a really interesting way to go. But there's so much more that we could do with this if you go back to this list, right? What are your interests? Who are the people that you can connect with? These conferences are great, and Michael does a great job with different topics. And I would encourage a lot of you to actually go to the other ones that Michael puts on, because I've been to a couple, and they're great. But then once you identify the connections, again, back to flipping the order, this idea of understanding that you now need to develop what you've gained an interest in much further before you can really start to deploy that. So I'm excited to be able to talk about what my interests are, but more importantly, who I'm doing this work with and how I'm developing good work around that, because I have this saying that I've been preaching lately, this idea that collaboration beats competition. And I really do believe, and it's why I started this company called Mick McConnell, that the premise is that there's so many other people out here that are doing better work than I am, that it's more fun to collaborate with the experts and do good work than to think that I can go do it alone. So I want to thank Michael for having me. It's a great opportunity to meet all of you. I've had a really good time on this trip, and thank you for everything.
Thank you for an awesome talk.